Alexander the Great, the Untold Epic. So imagine this. You're 20 years old. Your dad, the king, just got assassinated. You've barely proven yourself. You're surrounded by enemies. Everyone thinks you're too young to rule. Most people would be happy just to survive that. But Alexander the Great? He didn't just survive. By 32, he ruled the largest empire the world had ever seen. He never lost a single battle. He crossed deserts where entire armies should have starved, faced down war elephants in India, and created cities that still exist today. But here's the thing. The story you know about Alexander probably sounds like a highlight reel. Genius commander, unstoppable conqueror, guy who spread Greek culture everywhere. And sure, that's true. But the real Alexander was more complicated. He was brilliant and reckless, respectful and ruthless, inspiring and terrifying, sometimes all at once. He was obsessed with Achilles, convinced the gods had chosen him, and maybe buried alive. This isn't just a history lesson. This is the story of a man who chased immortality and came closer than almost anyone else in history. But the higher he climbed, the more dangerous it became. By the end, his victories didn't just change the world, they destroyed him. So buckle up, because once you hear this whole story, you'll see why Alexander's name has echoed for more than 2,000 years. Early life. Alexander was born in 356 BCE in the Macedonian capital of Pella. His dad was King Philip II, a tough-as-nails warrior who took Macedonia, a country most Greeks looked down on, and turned it into a rising superpower. His mom, Olympias, was a whole different story. She was fiercely ambitious and deeply religious, even participating in these wild cult rituals of Dionysus that sometimes involved snakes. In fact, one rumor said Alexander wasn't Philip's son at all. People whispered that Zeus had fathered him, disguised as a serpent in Olympias' bed. From the start, Alexander was different. As a kid, he showed insane confidence and intelligence. The most famous story is when he tamed a wild horse named Bucephalus. The horse was so fierce no one could ride him, but young Alexander noticed something. The horse was scared of its own shadow, so he turned it toward the sun, jumped on its back, and rode it. Everyone was stunned. Philip supposedly said, "My boy, find a kingdom big enough for you because Macedonia isn't." And that horse, Bucephalus, would ride with Alexander for years, all the way to India. Then came his education. Philip hired the best tutor money could buy, Aristotle. Yeah, that Aristotle. For 3 years, Alexander studied philosophy, science, politics, and most importantly, Homer's Iliad. He became obsessed with Achilles. He didn't just admire the hero, he wanted to be him. He carried a special annotated copy of the Iliad everywhere he went, even sleeping with it under his pillow beside his dagger. That's how deeply he tied his life to the myths. By the time he was a teenager, Alexander wasn't just a prince. He was being shaped into a leader who believed he was destined for greatness. And maybe the world started believing it too. The throne in Thebes. Fast forward to 336 BCE. Philip II gets assassinated during a wedding celebration. Just like that, 20-year-old Alexander becomes king. Sounds glamorous, but in reality it was a nightmare. Rivals inside Macedonia wanted the throne. Greek city-states thought this was their moment to break free from Macedonian control. Everyone assumed Alexander was too young to handle it. They were wrong. First, Alexander secured his own kingdom, eliminating rivals and making sure no one in Macedonia could challenge him. Then he turned to Greece. Athens wavered, but it was Thebes that pushed too far. Thebes rebelled. Alexander's response was brutal and fast. He marched his army south and surrounded the city before anyone realized what was happening. Thebes had one chance to surrender. They refused. What followed was a slaughter. Thousands were killed. 30,000 more were enslaved, and the entire city was leveled except for one house. The house of the poet Pindar, which Alexander spared out of respect for Greek culture. The message was clear. Rebellion would be crushed without mercy. After Thebes, no other city dared challenge him. He had secured Greece, and now he could pursue his father's dream, the conquest of Persia. Crossing into Asia. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont, the narrow strait that separates Europe from Asia. Before stepping onto the shore, he supposedly leapt out, threw a spear into the ground, and claimed Asia as Spear One land. That's how confident he was. His army was small by Persian standards, around 35 to 40,000 men. But these weren't amateurs. They were professionals who had trained under Philip and were fiercely loyal to Alexander. He had the phalanx infantry, the companion cavalry, and skilled light troops. It was the most versatile army in the world at the time. The first test came at the Granicus River. Alexander charged across the water and nearly died when an enemy noble split his helmet open with a sword. At the last second, one of his officers saved him. After that, his men believed the gods were protecting him. With the victory, the doors of Asia Minor swung open. City after city started surrendering, some by force, others willingly. And as he moved, Alexander wasn't just conquering. He was spreading Greek influence, founding cities, and weaving himself into the mythology of the land. He was building something bigger than an army's march. He was building a legend. Battle of Issus. In 333 BCE, Alexander met King Darius III himself at Issus. Darius had a massive army, possibly over 100,000 men. Alexander had less than half, but Darius made a mistake. The battlefield was a narrow coastal plain that cramped his huge force. Alexander led his cavalry straight at the Persian center, aiming right for Darius. The great king panicked and fled the battlefield, leaving his army to collapse. When Alexander captured the Persian camp, he found something unexpected. Darius's family. His mother, wife, and daughters had been left behind. Everyone assumed Alexander would treat them like trophies of war. Instead, he treated them with full royal dignity, even reassuring them that Darius was still alive. This shocked people. It wasn't mercy out of kindness, it was strategy. By treating Darius's family with respect, Alexander looked like a noble ruler, not just a conqueror. And in Persia, where royal blood meant everything, this made him look like a legitimate king. Egypt and the Oracle. After Issus, Alexander marched south and entered Egypt without a fight. The Egyptians welcomed him as a liberator from Persian rule. He founded Alexandria, a city that would become one of the most important in history, with its famous library and lighthouse. But Alexander wasn't satisfied with just building cities. He wanted divine confirmation of his greatness. So he trekked across the desert to the Oracle of Ammon at Siwa. The journey was brutal. His men nearly died of thirst, and at one point they were saved by a sudden rainstorm. Ancient writers spun it like the gods were guiding him. When Alexander finally reached the temple, the priests greeted him with reverence. What exactly they told him remains a mystery. Some accounts say they hailed him as the son of Zeus Ammon. Alexander never gave details, but after that visit, he began presenting himself not just as a king, but as a god's chosen son. To the Egyptians, this wasn't that strange. Pharaohs were considered divine, but to his Macedonian soldiers, it was weird. They respected Alexander, but calling him a god, that was pushing it. Still, the Oracle of Siwa added a new layer to his legend. Now he wasn't just Alexander the Conqueror, he was Alexander the Divine. The showdown at Gaugamela. After Egypt, Alexander turned east again. Darius wasn't finished, and this time he had assembled the biggest Persian army yet, maybe 200,000 strong. The place was Gaugamela in 331 BCE, a wide-open plain chosen by Darius to make the most of his cavalry and his scythed chariots, these terrifying wagons with blades sticking out of their wheels. On paper, Alexander was doomed. He had maybe 47,000 men against Darius's massive horde. But strategy matters more than numbers. Alexander arranged his troops in a flexible formation, leaving deliberate gaps in his lines. When the scythed chariots charged, his men simply opened the gaps, let them roll through, then closed in and cut the drivers down. The real moment came when Alexander personally led his companion cavalry in a wedge-shaped charge, aimed straight at Darius. Once again, Darius lost his nerve. He turned his chariot around and bolted. The Persian army saw their king flee and collapsed in panic. This wasn't just another victory. This was the victory. With Gaugamela, Alexander broke the backbone of the Persian Empire. Babylon, Susa, and even Persepolis, the glittering Persian capital, all fell into his hands. When he marched into Persepolis, he saw halls filled with unimaginable treasure. According to one account, it took 10,000 mules and 5,000 camels just to carry it all away. But then came the infamous fire. After a wild drinking party, Alexander either ordered or allowed Persepolis to be burned. Some say it was revenge for when the Persians burned Athens years earlier. Others say it was an accident, fueled by alcohol and chaos. Whatever the reason, the city went up in flames, symbolizing the end of Persian glory. Hunting Darius. Even after Gaugamela, Darius was still alive, and Alexander was determined to catch him. He marched east across Persia, pursuing the great king relentlessly, but fate intervened. Before Alexander could reach him, Darius was betrayed by his own men. A satrap named Bessos had him arrested and then murdered. When Alexander arrived, he found Darius's body abandoned on the road. Alexander covered him with his own cloak, gave him a royal funeral, and vowed revenge on Bessos. It might sound noble, but there was strategy here too. By honoring Darius, Alexander positioned himself as the rightful successor of the Persian kings. He was not just a foreign conqueror, but a legitimate ruler of Asia. Bessos fled east to Bactria, thinking the rugged terrain would protect him. Alexander chased him across mountains and deserts until Bessos was finally captured and executed. It was a brutal end, but also a warning. No one could defy Alexander and live. The edge of the world. By 327 BCE, Alexander had pushed his army to the edges of the known world. He crossed into India, a land of incredible wealth and strange wonders to the Greeks. Here he faced one of his toughest battles, against King Porus at the Hydaspes River. Porus had an army that included war elephants, something Alexander's men had never seen before. The elephants thundered into the Macedonian lines, trampling men and sowing terror. But Alexander adapted. He ordered his troops to target the elephants' handlers, turning the massive beast into uncontrollable chaos. After a long, bloody fight, Alexander emerged victorious. Porus was captured. When asked how he wanted to be treated, Porus famously replied, "Like a king." Alexander, impressed by his bravery, not only spared him, but gave him more territory to rule. This moment revealed something important about Alexander. He could be ruthless, but he also admired strength and loyalty. He often made defeated kings into allies instead of enemies. That was part of how his empire held together, but his army was exhausted. Years of non-stop campaigning had taken their toll. At the Hephaestion River, when Alexander wanted to march further into India, his soldiers flatly refused. They were done. For the first time, Alexander had to back down. He sulked in his tent for days, but eventually agreed to turn back. Even the greatest conqueror in history could not conquer his own men's fatigue. The long march back, the retreat from India, was anything but easy. Alexander decided to take his men back through the Gedrosian desert, one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. It was a disaster. Thousands died from heat, thirst, and exhaustion. Some historians think Alexander chose the route as a punishment for his men refusing to march further. Others say he wanted to outdo the legendary Persian king Cyrus, who had failed to cross it. Whatever the reason, the march nearly destroyed his army. Yet Alexander refused to drink more water than his men, even pouring out a helmet full of precious water rather than drink it alone. That kind of act kept loyalty alive, even in misery. When he finally emerged from the desert, his army was battered, but they still followed him. That was the kind of hold Alexander had, blending east and west. Back in Persia, Alexander began something new. He wanted to unite Greek and Persian cultures into one empire. He adopted Persian dress, demanded rituals of proskynesis where people bowed before him, and even encouraged his soldiers to marry Persian women. At one point in Susa, he staged a mass wedding, marrying a Persian princess himself, and having thousands of his officers marry local women in a single ceremony. To Alexander, this was about building unity. But to his Macedonian soldiers, it felt like betrayal. They had fought for years under Greek traditions, and now their king seemed more Persian than Macedonian. This tension boiled over in mutinies, most famously at Opus, where his soldiers openly rebelled. Alexander went into a rage, executing leaders and replacing Macedonians with Persians in his army. Eventually, he forgave the soldiers and reconciled, but the incident showed how fragile his empire really was. And here is a detail people forget. Alexander didn't just want to unite people by marriage or culture. He started training 10,000 young Persians in the Macedonian way of warfare, teaching them to use the phalanx. These were nicknamed the Epigoni, the successors. Imagine being one of Alexander's old Macedonian veterans and suddenly seeing Persians trained to fight exactly like you. No wonder tension was boiling over. The death of Hephaestion. Of all the blows Alexander suffered, none hit harder than the death of his closest companion, Hephaestion. The two had grown up together, fought side by side, and many ancient sources hint their bond was deeper than friendship. In 324 BCE, Hephaestion fell ill and died suddenly, possibly from fever or food poisoning. Alexander was devastated. He refused food, cut his hair in mourning like Achilles for Patroclus, and ordered massive funeral rites. Some accounts even claim he crucified the doctor he blamed for failing to save Hephaestion. This loss broke something inside him. Alexander had always chased greatness, but now he chased it with even more reckless obsession. He planned new campaigns, including an invasion of Arabia, but fate had other plans. The mysterious death. In 323 BCE, Alexander returned to Babylon. He was only 32 years old and at the height of his power. Then suddenly, he fell ill. For days, he grew weaker, unable to speak or move. Some sources say it was fever, possibly malaria or typhoid. Others whisper poison. Ancient gossip even claimed he was still alive when they sealed him in his coffin, paralyzed but not dead. The truth is, we may never know. But what we do know is that Alexander's death unleashed chaos. He had no clear heir. His generals, the Diadochi, tore the empire apart in brutal wars, carving it into kingdoms. Alexander's dream of a united empire died with him, but his legend did not. The legacy. So what did Alexander really leave behind? His empire fractured within a generation, but his impact went far beyond borders. He founded over 20 cities, most famously Alexandria in Egypt, which became a center of knowledge and culture for centuries. He spread Greek language, art, and ideas across 3 continents, creating what we now call the Hellenistic world. Without Alexander, the cultural mix that later influenced Rome, Christianity, and even modern science might never have existed, and his military genius is still studied today. He perfected the use of combined arms, mixing cavalry, infantry, and tactics in ways that set the standard for centuries. But maybe his greatest legacy is the story itself. A man who believed he was chosen by the gods, who carried Homer's Iliad into battle, who marched to the ends of the earth, chasing immortality. In a way, he got what he wanted. More than 2,000 years later, we are still telling his story. The end of Alexander the Great. So the question is not just how Alexander conquered the world. The question is why his story still grips us. Maybe it is because he represents the ultimate mix of brilliance and obsession, vision and destruction. He shows us what happens when a human being tries to become a legend. And maybe that is why Alexander the Great never really died. Because as long as his name is remembered, the empire he built in his mind is still alive.